Hi everyone and welcome to Epilepsy Research UK's Research Roundtable on Epilepsy in Childhood. My name is Caoimhe Tuig-Bennett and I'm Head of Research at Epilepsy Research UK. This is our first Research Roundtable of 2021 and it's clearly a very popular subject as we think this has been the fastest webinar of ours to fill up yet. And as usual, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers this afternoon. If I'll just change my slide. We'll firstly be hearing from Anushka, who is a medical student and also a member of Young Epilepsy's Young Reps. She'll be talking about her personal connection to epilepsy. And the Young Reps are a panel of 16 to 25-year-olds who advise young epilepsy on their work. And excitingly, they're also going to be reviewing applications for our joint funded fellowship, the Epilepsy Research UK and Young Epilepsy Research Fellowship, alongside our Scientific Advisory Committee to help maximise the potential impact of this research for young people living with epilepsy. We'll then be hearing from Dr. Sukhvir Wright from Aston University and Birmingham Children's Hospital. Dr. Wright was awarded an Emerging Leader Fellowship Award from Epilepsy Research UK in 2016 to investigate autoimmune-associated epilepsy. Then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Hannah Kofschoff from the University of Southampton, who is awarded funding from Epilepsy Research UK in 2019, which feels like a lifetime away now, for an Explorer pilot study to explore the epilepsy surgery pathway for children with epilepsies and their families. And our speakers have also contributed to our research blog in January. So if you're interested in hearing more, you can visit our website, and this link will also be available in the chat on screen and at the end of our webinar. We also have a blog from Annie, who is another young rep from Young Epilepsy. So thank you, Annie, for contributing to that as well. Following the talks, we'll have a roundtable session where our panelists will answer a selection of brilliant questions that have been submitted by viewers, researchers, and of course our own team. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Anushka, who will be joining us here. Hi, Anushka.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. So over to you.
Thank you. So, hi, I'm Anushka. I'm a first-year medical student, and the reason why I wanted to go into medicine is because of my condition, and it helped to spark an interest into science and particularly genetics. And I may potentially go into a field of genetics when I'm older. So in terms of my epilepsy journey, I was first diagnosed when I was around 12 years old, which was also when I had my first seizure, which happened at school. And I remember it was very unexpected and very surprising. I didn't really know what happened. And I then later realised that I had a family history of epilepsy. So on my dad's side, my uncle has epilepsy. And I have tonic-clonic seizures, and from after my first seizure when I was 12 to around GCSEs, I didn't have any seizures, and then I had a large cluster of them, which I think was partially due to subconscious stress and potentially being very overwhelmed during my exams because I didn't really have any good coping mechanisms at the time, with dealing with my first public exams. And since then I have not had any more seizures because I think I've been able to adapt, and I now know a lot more coping strategies to help when I feel very overwhelmed. And I also have no auras. So for example, I only know my triggers are potentially sleep deprivation. So for example, if I'm going on long flights, or if I have to wake up really early when going on holiday, for example, I make sure to take extra medication with me, and I'm a bit more cautious and potentially just feeling very overwhelmed, like I said, during my exams. And also because I have none of these auras, it was really important for me to do risk assessment. So for example, at home, we make sure that the doors, we try not to lock them as much, or that they open outwards. So for example, if I have a seizure in my room, my family can easily come and help me. And also it's really important as a uni student to make sure that the university was very accommodating for me, which they are, and to help with risk assessment within my uni room as well. But luckily it's quite well controlled, and I now know how to adapt and to sort of make sure I take my medications on time, and I'm not overly stressed to help minimize my getting the seizures. And also in terms of my transition of care, it was quite a scary process transitioning from going to the children's hospital into adult care, but luckily both of my parents are doctors, and particularly my mother, I think she was able to really help with sort of doing most of the talking for me at a young age, and sort of helping the medications that I was taking and being able to help with all the tests that was being run. And this was really helpful for me because it helped get rid of some of the stress and the feeling very overwhelmed in front of the doctors. And now that I've become more independent, I've learned a lot from when I go to appointments by myself, and it's been really sort of uplifting and helped my confidence by going by myself. And so yeah, that's basically my epilepsy journey, and now I'm a lot more focused and a lot more well adapted at being able to control those triggers that I mentioned.
Thank you so much, Anushka. That's a really inspiring story and brilliant to hear about your epilepsy journey. I'm sure that must have been so frightening, having the large cluster of seizures in the middle of your GCSEs and not having an aura as well. And I think you mentioned the transitioning of care, and that's something that we hear about so much, that clinicians are putting more and more time and resource into focusing on. And thank you for sharing how it felt to be going through that, because I think it's something that we're hearing a lot more about. So thank you so much, Anushka, for sharing your story. We'll be coming back to you at the end when we're answering the questions that have been submitted. And for now, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Sukhveer Wright. Thank you so much, Anushka, and thank you, Suki, for joining us. And yeah, we can see your slides, so that's running well.
Okay. Thank you, and thanks very much, Quiva and ER UK, for asking me to speak today about my research. So by the time I finished my session, probably about another 9 people, adults and children, will have been diagnosed with epilepsy, both within the UK and Europe. However, a small proportion of these patients won't respond to our standard treatments, and they may become drug resistant or drug refractory. So there is an urgent clinical need to try and find treatable causes, and that is what part of my research is trying to do. The normal role of the body's immune system is to protect us from infection by killing harmful bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms. You can see this here with a plasma cell, a B cell, producing antibodies to fend off invading bugs and protect us and our important organs like the brain from attack. But sometimes the immune system goes wrong. We don't know why. Their head may be turned by a tumour or a virus, and they therefore attack the body's own healthy immune cells and tissues. For example, this healthy looking brain cell here can then be recognised as being, again, an invading microorganism or something that they don't recognise, so antigenic, and therefore antibodies are produced by the body and attack these cells in the host. And these are called autoantibodies and lead to a very unhappy brain. So the antibodies that I research are human antibodies that target the extracellular surface or the sticky out bit of important brain proteins. And you can see an antibody flying in to attach to a protein here along the membrane, which is the wiggly line. When these antibodies bind, they disrupt the normal brain communication. They cause a range of symptoms, some of which I've listed here. But obviously I'm interested in the seizures that occur. So the research that I'm doing wants to answer the following questions. Do these antibodies actually cause seizures? Can we target the effects at the level of the protein that they bind to try and speed up the recovery? We already have quite good treatments in terms of immunotherapy, but they act to either remove the antibodies in the system or stop them being produced. And this can affect antibodies that are useful to us as well as those that aren't so useful. I also want to see if we can help to improve short-term, but also long-term outcomes, because we find that children affected with these type of seizures and encephalitis actually go on later in life to show some lower academic achievement and impaired cognition and thinking. So the brain protein I'm going to talk about today is the Nmda receptor. We need this essential brain protein for communication between cells, and also they have an important role in learning and memory. When the antibodies bind to the top of the receptors, as I've shown, they kind of hold hands or cross-link across the surface, and this causes them to be internalized or go below the surface. And this means you get a loss of the Nmda receptors, and this leads to a disruption in that function of the cells talking to each other to give you neuropsychiatric features, but also mainly seizures, as well as movement disorders. So what does this loss of Nmda receptors do? So here they are again, disappearing under the cell's surface. So in our modelling, these recordings, these black lines here, represent brain activity. And in the control trace above, you can see the activity burbling along in a straight line. Not too many abnormal events going on. But in the lower trace, you can see when you've got antibodies in the mix, there's lots of these kind of downward deflections and spikes. And these represent seizure type activity. So normally we try and get rid of these antibodies, as I said, by immunotherapy. But what happens if we can also help that receptor to come back as well? And maybe those Nmda receptors come back to the surface. Well, we've been trying to use a drug that does exactly that as part of its function, i.e. bring those Nmda receptors back to the cell surface so they can do their job. And you can see in the traces that when this drug takes effect, which is represented by the blue line here, there is some return to normality and less seizure activity. So there's encouraging preliminary results, but could it work in humans? So this is now an opportunity to talk about a very exciting collaboration we have with the Children's Hospital using human tissue for epilepsy research. And here we consent from patients and parents who are undergoing epilepsy surgery, as Hannah will talk about next. And they're having epilepsy surgery because after lots of detailed investigations, their clinical team has identified a part of the brain where the seizures are coming from, and this part could possibly be resected or removed safely, leading to, we hope, a reduction in seizures. So we're able to go to theatre on the day of surgery with consent, collect a piece of brain tissue that's going to be disposed of anyway. We then take this across the road to Aston University and we make very, very thin slices of the brain tissue and have a look at them under the microscope and try and record signals from them. In this picture, the circular object here is a brain cell, a neuron. And just to give you an idea of the size, next to it is the small blood vessel or capillary packed full of red blood cells. We then put a tiny glass electrode into these brain cells, and this acts as a listening device to let us know what signals are being received to that brain cell. Are they normal or abnormal? And then we can try and monitor the changes with different drugs. These recordings we get are very similar to the ones I showed you previously in our modelling. And what we were able to show is that when we tried the Nmda receptor drug, we saw a very similar response in the human tissue as to our modelling. So we hope this encouraging initial results means that if we were able to get this drug to the brain, it would do what we think and what we hope and reduce seizures caused by Nmda receptors. We also hope that if the drug is given early, it will prevent some of the longer term changes to cognition. These examples, drawings, are from a 15-year-old girl who had an Nmda receptor antibody encephalitis. As she gradually recovered from the acute phase of the illness, she was asked to draw something by the team. And at this stage, her medical assessments rated her as being moderately impaired. She didn't know what to draw, so they said, can you draw an animal, such as a dog? But she didn't know how to start. So they explained to her that the dog has 4 legs, a tail, 2 ears, 2 eyes, and a mouth. And she drew this quite abstract-looking picture in A. A few weeks later, when her cognition was scored as mild impairment, this time the picture in B, you can see she was asked to draw the same thing, and it's a bit more recognisable but human-like, standing upright with lists of body parts written down. 2 months later, cognition was rated as normal, but now her drawings are definitely more cat-like, but more representative of perhaps what a 5-year-old would do rather than a 15-year-old. And finally, 5 months later, off all medication, largely recovered, her drawing had a normal composition, it was colourful and bright, but she still had the urge to write down what she saw. And again, perhaps not quite what we'd expect from a 15-year-old. So these drawings are a powerful representation of the cognitive recovery that occurs and shows us that although some children appear to be doing well, there may be hidden effects that are not recognised. So we're aiming to try and identify these in our clinical studies at Aston University with affected patients. We want to find out first exactly what these difficulties are, if any, using brain scans like MRIs, MEG scans, which look closer at brain activity, and also neuropsychology assessments to get this information. And we hope this will form the basis of outcomes and we aim to achieve so that we can hopefully get these medications from the bench down to the bedside. So in summary, I hope I've been able to give you a snapshot of this research journey, and would like to finish by thanking the patients and the families, most of all, for generously contributing to the research, the funding bodies, particularly Epilepsy Research UK, and all these lovely people who have had the privilege to collaborate and work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suki. That's always so fascinating to hear about this area of research. Thank you so much. I love that. Well, it always gives me goosebumps, that slide at the beginning where you say that by the time I finish my talk, 9 more people will have been diagnosed with epilepsy. It's really shocking. And those drawings you had, another goosebump moment for me in that presentation, the difference in the drawings over getting the treatment. It's really quite emotional to see. And I wonder, I'm going to sneak in a question now, if that's okay, but roughly how many people are there in the UK that have autoimmune-associated epilepsy, or is that something that's even known?
It's actually really quite rare. It is pretty rare. We did a survey of children quite a few years ago now, sort of 2013, and in about a year we were about to identify about 40 to 50 cases per year, sort of within people that were reporting within the UK. But as it's becoming more recognised, we're getting more a much clearer idea of exactly how many people are being affected by autoimmune-associated epilepsy and encephalitis. But I think with more recognition, the incidence is kind of going to go up higher.
Wow, yeah, that's really rare, but such an important area to investigate further. So we'll come back to you at the end with some of the questions that have been submitted. But thank you so much, Suki. And now we're going to hand over for our final presentation of this afternoon to Dr. Hannah Kofschoff from the University of Southampton. So hi, Hannah.
Hi.
And thank you for taking the time to present your research to us as well. So over to you, Hannah.
Brilliant, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you to Caoimhe and thank you to Epilepsy Research UK as well for inviting me to come speak about our research here today. So our research is really interested in trying to understand children's and families' experiences of the epilepsy surgery pathway. And so many of you will know that when children, or anyone, but children in particular for this project, have uncontrolled seizures or refractory epilepsy, they're often referred to the hospital and to the Children's Epilepsy Service for investigations to assess their eligibility for surgery. And amidst these investigations in the hospital, they're also seen by the clinical psychology team. This project actually was originated by one of my clinical psychology colleagues who her clinical impression really was how challenging this time was in the lives of children and families. And of course, you know, where families are living with extreme stress, given that many of these children have uncontrolled refractory epilepsy at home, this time of coming into hospital and having multiple investigations across a long period of time, again, was a very challenging time. There was very little to sort of inform clinical practice in that regard. So by the time children with epilepsy are considered for surgery, the epilepsy is often having a very significant impact on their quality of life. So, this is across multiple domains, education, social relationships, accessing the community, being able to see friends regularly. And, so this project really aims to try to understand what that's like for children and families. On the positive side, we know that the possibility of surgery for children and families really offers some hope, especially for those who are really challenged by their seizures. For a lot of people, it may be a light at the end of a tunnel. And surgery is not always the answer for everyone. And so, it's really important for us to understand these experiences for family. Now, when we started to look at this, just to try to inform clinical practice, there was very little for us to understand, from a UK context, but also very little for us to go on in terms of children's experiences of surgery pathways. So looking at the literature, there's only one UK study that assesses family experiences from parental perspectives. Children's voices themselves are entirely unrepresented in the literature. And we don't actually know anything in the literature of family experiences where children weren't deemed eligible for surgery, but have been on perhaps an epilepsy surgery pathway for multiple years. And the other thing that we didn't know a lot about that we wanted to address in this project was the wider family context. So, for instance, siblings who have a child or a sibling at home with a severe medical condition, what's it like for those brothers and sisters to, fear for their sibling, but also to have that experience of a child in the family, who's experiencing these sorts of things as well. So our study aims to address this, and we also call it My Epilepsy Journey. And we started to talk about originally the epilepsy surgery pathway, and it became very clear that no one called it a pathway. For them, it was very much about this journey of getting through their epilepsy and telling their story as a journey. So we asked the questions of what are the experiences of children with epilepsy and their families. And in this project, we're particularly interested in hearing from children, as I say, to ensure that voice is represented in the literature and feeds into clinical practice. But also we really want to hear from those children with developmental disabilities. So we know that many children with epilepsy have additional developmental disabilities, and it was important for us to find ways to include them in our research as well. So in trying to figure out how best to represent these voices and how to capture voices, we engaged in a pilot study, which I can tell you a little bit about. We did interviews with children and with epilepsy medics, epilepsy nurses, educators, and young people themselves, as well as siblings. And we tried to figure out what are the best ways to do this and what is the best way to represent it. And we've come up with this life path method. And it sort of gives us a really lovely visual representation of people's journey. So this is Amy, it's just a portion of her journey. But, Amy says some really powerful things, about this dead patch in her life where she was having extreme seizures and she couldn't understand what was going on in her surgery, starting to recognize that she wasn't going to grow out of surgery. But, and statements like feeling like epilepsy has swallowed her childhood, but then, remembering the lovely things that happened in the hot parties and the gigs she'd go to. And Amy went on to have surgery as well. So Amy also talked about sort of being really proud and being able to cope with having a backpack and being able to put things into her backpack. So really representing a lot of interesting things that she told us that would be really great when, to start to feed it into clinical practice. So we started to collect these information, and then of course a pandemic happened, and we started to collect these data online now via Microsoft Teams, and we sort of show up with a range of different tools in order to best engage, especially young children perhaps, and those with developmental disabilities, to talk about their epilepsy. And sometimes it's about showing pictures or using symbols, using a toy that came to the hospital with them, and really sort of working with parents and families to try to gain these views as well. And I thought I'd end with showing our participant recruitment video, because it gives a sort of good sense of what the project is like in particular and what families see.
Thank you for helping us by taking part in the My Epilepsy Journey project. The University of Southampton, Southampton Children's Hospital and Epilepsy Research UK are working together to find out about the different experiences of epilepsy for families and young people. You have been asked to take part in this study because you are a brother, a sister, or a person who is on the epilepsy journey. To find out more, we'll have a conversation online with you, and you can show us photographs, drawings, and ideas about your epilepsy journey. We'll talk about your hobbies, activities that you enjoy in the community, and what you like to do at home, and who you like to look after. We'll talk about school life. What classes do you enjoy? What about your school friends? What has been hard for you and what has been enjoyable? We can also find out about your epilepsy journey. What was it like to have tests at the hospital? And in some cases, what was it like to have an operation? Don't worry, we'll use pictures and different ways for you to show how you feel about your epilepsy journey. We want to know your ideas about helping other young people and families on the epilepsy journey. You can also tell us if you think anything could be changed or improved to help you and other young people throughout the epilepsy journey.
Just stop it. There. So a huge thank you to my colleagues, my collaborators on the project as well, Anna Moore, Angela Griffin, Sarah Parsons, and Judith Bruce Golding, and of course the children and families who've taken part thus far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was a really interesting presentation, and seeing the epilepsy surgery pathway laid out in an actual pathway was really interesting and really visually you can see someone's life there. So huge thank you. And I thought that quote that someone saying that they felt as though epilepsy had swallowed their childhood was really moving as well. And I wonder, obviously you showed us the video there. Do you think that using kind of video content for the young people and their families is more engaging than just handing out like a 10-page document, let's say?
Yeah, that's sort of where we've come to. Of course, no one's going to read a 10-page document, are they? But it was also, as we started to move through collecting this information during the pandemic, everybody's staring at screens, and it was about trying to kind of give the information in an accessible way that children would find really engaging as well, and want to come and speak to us, because it's obviously harder to have those conversations online than it might be face-to-face with a young child.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. And we're now going to bring back in Anushka and Suki to answer some of the questions that we've had submitted by people watching. So hi again, everyone. Thank you so much for your talks. I think there's been such a broad selection today. And as you may know, we recently launched our SHAPE Epilepsy Research Network, where we've been asking people affected by epilepsy to complete some questions. And one of those has been, how has epilepsy interrupted your life? So Anushka, I thought we'd ask you, how do you feel that epilepsy has interrupted your life?
So I'd say, like I mentioned previously, a major part where it interrupted my life would be during my GCSEs. So not only academically, it was kind of like a bit of a vicious circle, because I was worried about the work, which caused me stress, and then I was going to have tests, which made me miss out on the work, which then caused more stress. So it felt very invasive, and I was a bit confused as to why I was having all these tests and what was the reason for them. And also socially, so because I was missing out on a lot of school at that time, I wasn't able to see all my friends, and I felt a bit isolated and not really sure who to talk to about it. And then on a day-to-day basis now, luckily it's quite well controlled, and I feel like I'm living to my best, like the best life now, and there's not really anything that's changed majorly, apart from obviously being mindful of the triggers that I mentioned, such as taking medication on time, making sure if I've gone to bed late that I'm still waking up early to take medication and not forgetting to take it. But on a day-to-day basis, in general, there hasn't been any major interruptions, which I'm quite grateful for.
Brilliant. And Hannah and Suki, from your perspectives as researchers and in your professional capacities, what do you see as the main ways that epilepsy interrupts lives? So Suki, if we go to you first.
Yeah, I think Anushka has mentioned so many things really beautifully and very clearly about how epilepsy interrupts lives. I think the thing I take away often is that children are really resilient, actually. Even though their lives are interrupted, they do kind of get on with it and keep going. But I think one thing that doesn't go away is the parental anxiety. So I think as well as the impact on the children, it's also the impact on the parents and how their lives are interrupted, particularly just by the unpredictability. Just talking to a parent on the phone the other day and saying that, you know, she's even worried about her daughter crossing the road. If she had an absence, what would happen? And just, you know, small things like that. But there's also that worry. So in some ways we did kind of say lockdown is positive because at least you could keep an eye. But, you know, there's also going to be a transition now back to a new normal after this. So I think as well as the children, it's the parents as well. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. And Hannah, how about you? What do you think has been the main way?
Yeah, just echoing what Anushka and Suki have said. I mean, parents have said very similar things to us about that concern and that worry. You know, your role as a parent is to protect your child, and sometimes that role is taken away from you in a way. You're just doing your best to manage it all. It's interesting that in our pilot study, lots of young people talked about it becoming more difficult as they got older because they became much more aware of what they were missing out on. So, this need to put on a brave face, not only for their friends but also for their families, being really aware of that concern from their parents as well. With social media now, you know exactly what you're missing out on. And so that, it's that sort of thing that people talked about, that sort of getting a bit older and feeling like you're missing out on what other people are doing.
Of course, yeah, you can definitely identify with that. And so on the flip side of that, Anushka, what is there one thing that you think would be life-changing for you in terms of your epilepsy?
So I think, luckily for me, when I was able to get a good medication that didn't have any adverse side effects from quite a young age, and from those around me, including myself, I don't notice any differences when I'm on or off the medication. And apart from the medication that I take every day, that there's not really anything else that's kind of quite interrupting my life. So I think for me personally, there's not one thing that I would need that would be majorly life-changing for me, but I do know that for others, that they would really want to have well-controlled medication for them, or potentially even operations to help with their seizures.
Brilliant, thank you. And Hannah, how about you and the people with epilepsy you meet? What one thing do you think would be life-changing for them?
I would probably say really better informed support, which is kind of where this project comes in for families. So not just psychological support, how to support the young people with all of those difficulties that you kind of saw a little bit in Amy's journey that she was experiencing, but families as well, siblings, social support. So families talk a lot about sort of, your child's diagnosed and you end up on this pathway and you're entering sort of this medical vortex and you're learning a new language and it's all encompassing. And actually that social support of families that are like you, that are also in the same vortex is really, really life-changing, I think, for families. And then the final thing is probably financial support, actually. So, parents are taking time off work to go to medical appointments. Just attending hospital appointments, travel and parking and food at the hospital, all those things, really add up. So those sort of practical, logistical difficulties that we often don't think about. And maybe COVID gives us an opportunity to change that, because, you would often have to take a day off work to attend a medical appointment. And if it's not a medical investigation, then perhaps more can be done online. I don't know what Suki would say about that, though.
Mm-hmm. And Suki, how about you? What would be life-changing for patients?
Yeah, no, I just agree with Hannah that we definitely are seeing the benefits of some of the online clinics and keeping in contact with families in that way. I think if I could wave a magic wand, and I'd really like to take away that unpredictability that I was talking about. I'd really like it if a patient could come to me in clinic, we'd look at their EEG, we'd look at their MRI, we'd look at their history, perhaps even their microbiome, I don't know, just analyze all of that. And then we could say to them, okay, you need to take this one drug and it's going to give you a 95% chance of controlling your seizures. And I just think being able to do that for each patient would be really good, just to take away that unpredictability and give them more confidence in, the treatments that we're giving them. And yeah, so trying to get good personalized treatments, I think, for each patient would be good.
Definitely. And on that topic, we've had a question on Facebook for you, Suki. You mentioned potential medications in your presentation, and someone has asked, how far off are these medications from being available, and will they help children currently impacted by epilepsy, or will this be for future generations?
That's a really good question. I didn't talk much exactly what the drugs were, but the whole one of the main aims of the project that I'm doing is trying to use drugs that are already available, although they might be being used for other conditions or other indications. So we're kind of repurposing, if you like, these medications, which has some benefits because it means that they've already been studied in terms of patient safety. The problem is that often they're drugs that are used in adults, not children. So there always are going to have to be additional studies to find out how children's bodies sort of process the drugs compared to adults, which will be different. So I hope, but I think we always say this, maybe 5 to 10 years, hopefully, if we can try and get these drugs to clinical trial. But hopefully by using new indications for old drugs, that journey will be quicker.
Mm-hmm. And sorry to put you on the spot again, Suki, but we had a question just asking what an MEG scan is. So would you like to just explain what that is? I don't think I can pronounce it, so.
So yes, should I just say MEG scan as well, because it's easier to say. It's magnetoencephalography. Yeah, it's an MEG scan. So basically, this is an imaging technique. It's kind of a combination between an MRI and an EEG, and it identifies brain activities and really measures kind of small magnetic fields that are produced in the brain, and it gives you kind of more what we call source localization. So it gives a better and a more detailed map of where any abnormal activity is going on in the brain. So it kind of uses techniques of sort of magnetic fields as well as EEG to give you this scan. And people sometimes have it for epilepsy surgery, for example, because as we said, you need to find out exactly where seizures are coming from if you're thinking of resecting part of the brain. So you can use the MEG scan for that. And we're hoping to use it for that, but also to give us an idea of underlying cognition and cognitive processes.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thank you. And let's see, what's our next question? So Anushka, you had mentioned previously about being involved, that you've previously taken part in research. So we just wondered if you'd like to say a bit about that and how you find that process.
Yeah, so I actually got enrolled in the 100,000 genome project when I was around 15. So where they look at all your whole genome, including my parents, just to see if there's any differences and potentially what could be causing my epilepsy. So I think around a year ago, they sent a letter to me in the post saying that at the moment they hadn't found any major differences or anything like that, but they're still looking. And being part of the project was really useful. I actually learned a lot about it. For example, how they store the data, how they find the research, and how they collect it. And also I was part of actually writing the cover head that went out to the 16-year-olds about the reconsenting process. So I also found out how important consenting was, and how important it is for at 16 to actually have a voice and to say if you want to still participate in it. So in general, being part of the project was really useful to me, and I'm just waiting to see if they find anything.
Fantastic. It must have been an amazing insight to have, especially as a medical student as well, with an interest in genetics too. And Hannah and Suki, you've both mentioned about patients and their families being involved in your research, and I wondered if you'd like to comment on how valuable that's been. So Hannah.
I mean, I'm not a neurologist, so my starting point isn't the brain. My starting point really is those children and families, and trying to gain, you know, to amplify their voices, to gain their voices, and to help, you know, to bring them together to help inform clinical practice. So yeah, absolutely, it's my starting point, that value of ensuring that that is heard.
Fantastic. And Suki?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're inspired by patients. You know, we're also challenged by patients as well to try and improve their outcomes. I get asked really good questions by patients actually, and hearing that Anushka was actually able to form part of the kind of information is that's really good and really useful, because it just helps everyone to learn, the researchers and also who you're trying to contact, and just, yeah, generally blown away by the generosity of time that people give to be part of research. And I think, as I said, often also because the research sometimes isn't actually of direct benefit to themselves, but they'll still want to take part because they want to improve, you know, outcomes for everybody. So yeah, it's great to be involved with patient research.
Thank you. And I think your research is interesting, even though a lot of it is lab-based, it's translational lab-based, and it translates right through to your work in the clinic. And we actually will share the details on screen later of our SHAPE Epilepsy Research Network if anyone watching this webinar would like to join the network and potentially get involved in research in the future into epilepsy. And we've had another question from the audience for Anushka. Let me just find it. Nick has asked, have you found as you've got older that your medications had to change regularly as they find the right mix of medication to control seizures, or?
So for me, I think I remember when I was first diagnosed, I went through a couple of medications. One of them, I don't know what it was called, but one of them was really bad for me. I had very adverse reactions. And then at around 15-ish, I kind of stuck to one medication and I've had it ever since. And the only thing that really changes for me is that I have an emergency medication. So for example, if a seizure lasts longer than 5 minutes, and also a medication that I take alongside the one that I usually take. If, for example, I'm waking up really early and having a lot of sleep deprivation, or that I just increase my dose for a period of time and then slowly wean off it. But apart from that, I have the same medication, and I have done since 15.
Brilliant, thank you. And I suppose it's important to say that all of those changes would have been closely monitored by your neurologists and specialists as well. But thank you for sharing that. And so back to Hannah and Suki, I wonder if you'd like to talk about how the results of your research will be used and what impact they could potentially have for treatments and practice across the UK. Suki?
Yeah, sure. As we discussed, hopefully if we can repurpose some of these drugs, we can try and use them early on in some of these epilepsy-related disorders to try and, as well as stopping the acute symptoms like the seizures, but like we said, stop any long-lasting changes in the brain that lead to those later changes in kind of cognition. I think the interesting overlap is also that these brain proteins are affected not only in immune types of epilepsy, but also genetic epilepsy. So, for example, the Nmda receptor can be disrupted in a genetic epilepsy. So perhaps, again, if they find drugs that are useful in an Nmda receptor type of epilepsy, and I find a drug used in immune, you know, we can swap those kind of research findings as well. So it may not be just applicable to this type of epilepsy, but other types of epilepsy as well. So yeah, hopefully there'll be some impact there.
Brilliant. That's really exciting that even though it's a rare epilepsy, there could be some of the findings could be generalizable to other conditions as well. And Hannah, how about the results of your research? What impact do you think they'll have for people with epilepsy?
Yeah, so given that our research is really focusing on this time on the epilepsy surgery pathway where children are being considered for surgery, you know, and it could be a really long time. So sometimes the first time surgery is discussed with a family, they might think, brilliant, I'm going to have surgery. And actually it could be years of investigations that are you know, could be repeated, and you go into the hospital for a stay, for instance, and you're not having enough seizures, so actually you have to go away and come back. And so it's a long, protracted, often process that can be really difficult for families. And as I've said, you know, the aim really is to try to inform practice by hearing from those families, from those young people themselves, and from the wider family, parents and siblings as well. And just to feed that back into the practice and to think about how we can improve that surgery pathway for families, because it's a significant chunk of life. So, you know, anything from their perspectives that we can do to improve that is a relatively, you know, often doable things from the hospital point of view would be a great win from this study. And that would be our aim, is just to feed that right back into the pathway.
Of course, and obviously we began these webinars due to the current ongoing pandemic, but of course we've enjoyed hosting the webinars. But I wonder if you'd like to comment on the impact that the pandemic has had on your research, Hannah.
Yeah, so I've said a little bit about this in the blog and in the talk as well. So we had originally envisaged we would be attending, you know, our researcher would be attending the hospital appointments when families came in and be able to sort of engage with children at the hospital and maybe even bring the siblings, or for those families who are not on the pathway any longer, because we also speak to families who are no longer on the pathway, that we might go into the family home. But of course, neither of those are available to, you know, at the moment. So we've been trialing a range of different ways of engaging families and children online, via Teams, via Zoom. We've been using different technologies to try to do interactive little games to try to ensure children. So we've used sort of things like Miro, where children can move things about a screen and use emojis to help represent their experiences. We might use some PowerPoint slides, some symbols. And so, I mean, for us, it was you know, a shock at first, and, you know, thinking like, gosh, how are we going to do this? And then, you know, for some families, actually, they've really enjoyed it. And they've said, well, you know, it's much better for my child because she can run in and out of the room and doesn't have to sit in a hospital appointment. So I'm hoping there'll be a net benefit from doing them online. But yeah, because completely changed the way we thought we would do things.
Of course. And how about your research, Suki?
Yeah, so we did have to stop quite quite a bit of the research during the lockdown, mainly because of lab space and social distancing and just obviously the national lockdown. But I think that gave us some time for reflection and analysis of results, which is always something you put off as a researcher. It's really quite exciting getting all the data, but actually sitting down and analysing it. Yeah, so it was quite good to be forced to do the analysis, which was good. And I think for the clinical stuff, exactly as Hannah has said, we're trying to explore different ways of engaging families. So for example, for the neuropsychology assessments, trying to get those online. Yeah, so that would be good. Yeah, and also I think looking after my research team and their mental health, I think was something that I hadn't sort of thought about before, but not as much. I think I had new lab members, for example, who didn't have family in this country, and then when they went into lockdown, they were really isolated. So again, it's a matter of keeping the team together as well, getting through it, because we needed to go out and do research once this is all over. So yeah, it's been a challenging time, as for everyone.
Of course. And Anushka, it must have transformed how you've been studying in this time as well.
Yeah, so especially for medicine, there's a lot of aspects where you need face-to-face learning. So particularly last term, there was meant to be a lot of face-to-face meetings, potentially GP placements that we were meant to have this year that are getting cancelled. But I think even though it is a lot more harder doing it online, sort of everyone's in the same boat, everyone's still helping each other out, and they're all quite supportive. And there's always, for example, people you can ask if you have any questions about or any queries. So it is definitely different and unexpected, but I'm still happy with the way I'm learning, and I'm still still happy that I'm able to go to uni as well.
Of course. And we've had a brilliant question from the audience, and I'm going to potentially put our researchers on the spot a little bit here. But obviously, this question is from John. Some children grow out of their seizures. Do we know if that could potentially provide any clues as to how to help the people who have refractory epilepsy and children with refractory epilepsy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think it's one of the joys of doing paediatric epilepsy is that there are some of these epilepsies that children do grow out of, for example, childhood absence epilepsy. But no, as far as I know, I don't think we do know why children grow out of them. And I think studies like Anushka mentioned, like the 100,000 Genome Project. So I think genetics, a lot of epilepsies in the past we sort of labelled idiopathic, but they probably have a genetic basis, and perhaps it's the genetics, I think, that will give us the clue as to why some epilepsies you grow out of and why some of them continue. But yeah, no, it's a really good question.
Of course, thank you. And then it's time for our final question. This has flown by, but we wanted to ask all of you, what are your hopes for future research into epilepsy? So Anushka, how about your hopes for the future?
So I think for me, I know a lot of people, for example, that it takes them a very long time to pick out the right medication for them, or they're still trying to find the correct medication and they have very severe side effects for them. So even though this doesn't directly affect me, I think in general it'd be really important to put more research into drugs and trying to find more drugs for people that there's less reactions for them. And also, obviously, if it's more youth participation, I think it's really important, especially if you're looking at research for young people, to get their opinion and their voice and potentially a different perspective than other people, just to make sure you're accommodating for everyone and their own experiences.
Thank you, Anushka. Hannah, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, couldn't have said that better, Anushka. That's exactly what my hope would be. I mean, we're really grateful to RUK for the funding because qualitative research is not a primary form of research in epilepsy at all, and that's quite understandable. It's a neurological condition. But, you know, I guess, yeah, my hope is that patient voice, and especially, as Anushka says, children and those marginalised groups of children, so those with developmental disabilities, and children are really feeding into that, and that we find a way, because the onus very much is on us as researchers to find a way to hear that voice and to ensure it's represented in practice. So yeah, we need to get better at that.
Thank you. And finally, Suki.
Yeah, I think my main hope for future research into epilepsy, that research into epilepsy continues and grows, and obviously with the help and support of ER UK, whose primary focus is epilepsy. I think that's really important, and exactly as Hannah and Anushka have said, the sustained kind of input of patients and what they want us to research about. It should become, you know, the new normal to have patients and families right at the beginning of a research idea, and then to carry on. So like your campaign, the shaping the future, that's exactly what we need. We need the research to continue and to be directed to where it's actually going to be useful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Suki. And that's so true, yes, that we do need more participation in research into epilepsy from all people who've been affected by epilepsy. And thank you so much. I think that's a really positive note that we're able to leave the webinar on there. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our fantastic speakers, to Suki and Hannah for sharing your fantastic research that's happening, but I think the special shout out has to go to Anushka for sharing your journey and answering the questions. I think it's a really inspiring journey, and you've even though your seizures are under control, that you were talking about one of your hopes is for more medications with the fewer side effects. That seems to matter so much and resonate with so many people watching. So thank you so much. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Hannah and Suki have contributed to our research blog, and we've also had another blog from Annie, who is another young rep working with Anushka. So if you're interested in hearing more, you can read our research blog. It will be linked in the chat in a few moments, or you can use that link on screen. We also heard a lot from our researchers and from Anushka on taking part in research. So if you're interested in taking part in research, and if your life has been interrupted by epilepsy, you can shape the future of research by joining our Shape Epilepsy Research Network. And we'll again have the details of that, well, they're on screen here and they'll be in the chat box in a moment. So a huge thank you again to all of our speakers. A huge thank you to all of you for watching and taking the time out of your day to watch this webinar. Thank you to my colleague James, who has been busy behind the scenes ensuring that everything runs smoothly. So thank you, and we hope to welcome you back for more research roundtables in the future. Thank you.